Last time on Hot Track RC, we unboxed the Jay Halsey edition of the RC10. Now we've got to build it, so stick around! On today's build, we're going to use the Fast Eddie's ball bearing kit. This one's for the RC10 Classic. Now this isn't going to have the correct bearings in it for the front wheels of this car. Jay's wheels were aftermarket and they used 3/8 inch OD bearings. They use the same 3/16 inch shaft, the axles are the same, but the wheels require a larger OD on the bearing. Watch out, the kit calls out 5/16 inch OD unflanged bearings. That's not correct. These are 3/8 inch bearings that are required for these wheels. And that does make sense because that's what like the new 2.2 J Concepts wheels have gone to. They all use the 3/8 inch OD. It's a larger ball inside the bearing. It's a better bearing, which is probably part of the upgrade that Jay was making with those wheels. But if you get a kit, and maybe they start coming out with kits for this Jay Halsey edition, make sure that it shows the 3/8 inch OD unflanged bearings. And there should be 4 of them. So just watch out on that. Then we're also going to change out to black oxided E-clips because it's more vintage appropriate. That's what came with the original kits. The new re-release kits all come with the silver plating on those E-clips. I'll link to McMaster-Carr so that you can order those online if you like. If you're not familiar with McMaster-Carr, it's sort of an industrial supply online store that you can buy a lot of different hardware. Lots of hardware for vintage cars on there that's a little bit hard to find. So I'll link to that. I'm also going to switch out to new old stock screws for the pan. And these were 832 aluminum flathead Phillips head drive screws originally. In the new kits, they give you the hex drive black oxide screws. I don't like those. They just don't look right, particularly on the gold pan because they're all black against the gold. So this is what should be in there. It takes 17 screws though. It's a lot of screws to round up. I happen to have them in my parts stores. You also need 2 7/8 inch long 832s for the bell cranks, and you need 1 1/4 inch long screw for holding the nose piece to the pan. So let's get building. There's a gold pan and a manual on the workbench. Let's go. As I open up the hardware, I'm going to be ditching these steel flathead hex drive screws in favor of aluminum Phillips head drive flatheads, which is what this kit should have. So I'm going back with some vintage screws. This is the first kit I've built that I've seen where it tells you to put 4 of these washers under this body mount, which really is what it always needed. I think back in the day, I put one of the thick bronze bushings under there to give it some more height. These are 7/8 inch long screws, and they act to connect the nose plate to the pan, but they're also the bell crank screws. When you're installing flathead screws in a thin material like this, the cone of the flathead can penetrate all the way through the thickness of the pan and start to interfere with the threaded hole above it. And that's what's happening here. When I tightened that screw down, it didn't fully compress the pan against the nose plate. So I checked the original screw, same problem. The issue here is that they countersunk those screw holes in the pan a little too large. That's why these always protruded under the pan a bit on the original, and you might think, oh, I should countersink them more. This screw has a relief behind it. I got this off of McMaster-Carr, so it can install into a thin pan and not hit the threaded hole above it. And so my fix here was just to tighten the screws down more, which would have crushed the aluminum a bit and finally compressed everything together. So that seemed to work. And now I'm going to Loctite this little screw because it has a habit of coming out, and I'm happy with that one. These bell cranks are one of the more fragile parts on the RC10, and I believe they were taken from a prior car. These were not tooled up specifically for the RC10. And the originals had a straight edge right where that round bump is that I'm putting this screw in. It did not have that curve there, and the wall thickness was really thin on the top, and they always cracked right there. These are made out of Delrin. That is what I believe, at least. It's not nylon material like all the other structural parts on this car. They're Delrin. I think that's because Delrin's a little stiffer than the nylon, and so maybe they thought that was important for these bell cranks to have a little bit more stiffness. Anyway, that's my theory. I don't know that for a fact, but it's definitely different material. All right, here we go. Let's open up the front suspension components bag. Here is the special front shock tower and hardware. Now, I'm not going to go with these chrome E-clips. I'm going with these black oxided E-clips because that's what was on the original gold pans. There's something interesting about these caster blocks that we're going to come back to later, but in the meantime, this all builds up just like I remember back in the 80s. And here we have our steering blocks. Always put a little bit of Loctite for that nut, or that's going to fly off at some point. But these steering blocks are reversible. Just put one of the ball studs on opposite the other, and you'll have a pair. Now, for some reason, I always put these axles in backwards the first time. I've done this so many times, I can't believe I haven't learned yet. But anyway, the short end goes into the steering block, and then the E-clip will pop right in there. On the later pan cars, the axles were in line with the kingpin, but the early cars were offset like this. And so that kingpin I'm putting in does not go through the axle. It trails, the axle trails behind. And of course, that gives you a little bit different steering geometry. And the caster blocks are marked left hand and right hand since they're not symmetrical. And you can see also the arm is marked. That caster block has a little bit of a greenish tint to it, unlike most of the other plastic on this car. That suggests to me that it probably has some glass fill in it. That's usually what causes a white plastic to turn a little greenish. Don't know that for sure, but kind of looks that way. So here we go. We've got our assembly, it's articulating, and we just need to build up the other side. And there we have our set. The manual shows picking the lowest upper shock tower mounting point, and later you'll see that that creates a very high ride height for this car. I imagine that that is the way Jay had his, that they wanted a lot of suspension travel and droop on the suspension. I would never drive it that way on a carpet track. It's way, way, way too high off the ground, but it's kind of cool to see it this way. We'll look forward to that later. I've got the ball studs in here, and now I'm going to put my arm mounts in. And this manual tracks a lot closer to the original sequence than the RC10T manual did. The T manual was really kind of bizarre with the order of installation that they call out. And here's our shock tower assembly. I'm liking the way that looks. So time to put it into the car. And now we get to use more of these aluminum Phillips head fasteners. All right, I can't help myself. I just love these things. And I apologize probably that not everybody's going to have access to these. This is something that I did different on this car, but I just wanted to personalize it a little bit for myself. I have such strong memories of these Phillips head fasteners and installing them as a kid. Now they seem really crude. You would never see this large a fastener. But there's the gold showing through the arm mounts and the bottom of the pan. So I'm happy. So time to move on to mounting the arms to the car. And this goes pretty easily. Everything slides together. I would say in general, most of the suspension components on this car have a little bit of clearance with the pins. Nothing is terribly tight, which, maybe it could be a little bit snugger, but I didn't see anything that's egregiously loose, but it's not super tight. There's our E-clips against the white plastic, and we're starting to see a classic short arm gold pan coming together. That Jammin' J laser etch sure looks good on there, but it's right under the servo. Here are the gearbox components all laid out. I really like the way this transmission fits together. This pin falls in place very easily, no problem there. Goes right into the slot in the spline plate. And get a little Loctite on here because this nut is buried deep in the transmission. We don't want to come back and have that loosen up on us. And then we will install the idler shaft. Now they say to put some Loctite on here to keep it from spinning, presumably, which I don't think would ever be a problem. But then we got this E-clip that is bowed outward. We'll put that in place. Everything goes together quite easily, surprisingly. Any of this stuff could be a real problem if the tolerances were out a little bit, but I didn't find any issues in this transmission. So now we're going to use ball bearings instead of these bushings, and you'll need 2 ball bearings. One is flanged, one is unflanged. The clearances in this final drive gear are really close, and the bearings fit perfectly. I've had these old vintage ones where the bearings wouldn't go in, but no problem with these. And now, of course, there are tools made for putting these internal retaining rings in. I don't have one. I use a pick. And now these spin quite nicely on the shafts. We want to get a little Loctite on the retaining screws. Those will come out on you, although those can be tightened without taking the transmission apart. Here are the most vexing little screws, maybe in any kit. These things are tiny. I believe that's an 050 hex tool. And it actually goes in tightly into that hex. You would think it would be loose. But if it feels loose, push on it a little harder and it kind of snaps into place. And here I'm struggling to get it out. It's actually stuck in there, which is a really good thing because these are so tiny. If there's any play, you're going to wallow out the end of that thing and ruin your fastener, and there's no way you're going to get these in. So take your time, work them in slowly. They will go in. I had no problem. So I've had to replace these idler gears on other cars plenty of times when I'm running too few turns, and you can strip these out, but these went together really nicely. Next step is to assemble the top shaft. The ball bearing goes in this housing, which goes on the diff hub, and that fits together really snugly, but well. They tell you to put a little diff lube inside this conical taper between this gear and this diff, and then tap it with a hammer. And that's the way they always were, and yeah, once you tap it, it's tight. Here's a little bushing. There's another bushing that goes in the other side with a washer. That's going to sit against a thrust bearing, washer on the other side. Let's put some black grease on those balls that are retained in the housing. This all makes things very easy that it's retained. And then it slides together, and now we have this rather unique 6-gear transmission. All right, let's go to the spur gear. We're going to have to put the balls for the ball diff in these pockets. There's a number on one side of that diff gear, and you flip it over, and the balls drop right in the other side per the manual. So I put some grease in the pockets, and now put grease on the balls themselves. And we got that diff plate that goes on each side. That's a hardened steel smooth surface for those balls to ride on. And now the spring and the retainer and our lock nut. The manual says to tighten this nut all the way down until the spring goes flat. I think that's to break in the spring. And then you back off until the tip of the screw is just protruding beyond the lock nut. Everything feels smooth and operates as it should. Now we'll put this gear assembly into the transmission case, and I always just put both halves on this. The manual shows doing like open heart surgery on this thing, but I see no reason to do that. Just put the housing together and then attach it to our motor support, and then we'll be able to build up the rest of the transmission. I never put Loctite on these fasteners. I'm sure I should. Just bad habit. I don't remember ever doing it. Probably didn't have it when I built the first kit. I think it helps that it's crushing the nylon case a little bit and creating some resistance and compression so that they don't tend to back out so much. but they're easily accessible. Put some Loctite on it, then you won't have to worry. There's this little nut that goes in the side because that last screw does not intersect with the motor support, but that goes together easily. And then I snug everything up. Now we get to put the top shaft in. This is where they would have had you put this in already and hold things together, but it goes right in there. It's no problem. Now the final bearing on the other side. Now this one you have to push in deeper. It's the same support as on the other side, but it takes a smaller size bearing and it fits into the inner step. This, you're supposed to cut a pocket out for this E-clip to make it easier. And I always did that in the past, but on this one I decided to see if I could get it in without doing it. And sure enough, I could. And I kind of like that. I don't like gouging out the side of that little nylon housing, bearing support. And so now I'm happy everything's together. And we just have to put these dust seals in here, and these little plastic retainers, they never fit tightly enough, but the transmission feels really smooth. I'm happy. All right, here's the rear shock tower. This is the traditional fiberglass piece, and these screws go in tightly just like they did back in the day, so hopefully the handle on your hex driver is comfortable. We'll put a little Loctite in there. There was only one mounting point option on these early shock towers, which is the way this kit is, so no way to get it confused with the wrong hole. Coming up, you'll see that the wing tubes are already installed on the bulkhead, and they're much nicer quality than the originals. We'll put these ball studs in the original mounting locations from the 1984 Edinger kit, but there is a provision for an inner location that would have been used on the later versions of the Pan cars. Now, notice that the manual calls out for a 3/8 and a 5/16 inch screw on the shock tower, but it only gives you 3/8 inch screws. It does not give you the 5/16. There's the original manual page that didn't differentiate. I think they were all the same back in the day. It's a really minor point, but that might be confusing because you'll look around for the other size screw and they're not going to be there. This looks really nice. Nevertheless, you can see the lower screws stick out just a little bit of the back, but no big deal. So now to mount the bulkhead in the Pan and back to the aluminum flatheads. And we'll tighten those down, just leave them loose so that we can get the side bulkhead screws in. Make sure everything lines up. These are long screws, but they really need to be. This bulkhead adds a lot of structural rigidity to the rear of the car. If those screws are not tight, things flex way too much. So snug them up, but don't strip them out. Now for the gearbox. 4 flatheads to retain that gearbox. As has been the case with the reissue Pans, it does include the provisions for mounting a stealth transmission if you ever wanted to. Now we'll put the transmission brace in, but we'll start with the body mount. 2 washers under that. I think the original kit instructions showed 1. And there's no countersink on the plate. There never was. There is on some of the newer transmission braces. And then we'll put the fasteners into the bulkhead and the transmission, tighten everything up. Actually, leave those just a bit loose until we get these final screws in place. I'm very nervous always about potentially cross-threading these. So take your time, line it up, make sure everything starts before you torque down, and then snug it up. Now we can tighten down the transmission to the Pan, and then we can go up and finish the transmission brace. And by doing it in this order, everything will come together, snug up really nicely, and that's starting to look like the rear of an RC10. What is it about the gold with the white plastic on these? It's just so cool looking. All right, let's dive into the rear arms now. And these go together easily. Again, they're marked left and right, both the arm mount and the arm itself. And the pins go through easily, like I mentioned before. Not too snug. It flaps and falls easily, so you won't have any binding. And I always build the long wheel base version. That's what the original kit showed. And it seems to me if you build the short wheelbase, you're just going to have more motor weight hanging out further beyond the rear axles. So I don't know, I'm just sticking with the long and just work these screws in. Note that those rear arm mounts have anti-squat on them. They're angled. You can kind of see that in that shot. The front is up higher than the back. If you reverse those, it'll do some very wonky things to your suspension, and the dog bones might not fit correct and all that. Okay, so now our rear axle assemblies, they go together really easily, except for this roll pin that has to go in here. I had a bad experience with the RC10 T-roll pins. Even when I got it to go, it like peeled away steel off the roll pin. It was so tight. And so I was having the same feeling here, and I couldn't get the thing to start at all. So I decided, let me pull out some of my vintage pins and see how they fit in here. And really, when I got this, it seems similar in terms of not really wanting to stick. Ideally, I could get the edge to kind of start into the hole, which I did a little there. Now, this pin went in nicely. Once I got it going there, it slid in, and then I was able to modulate it pretty well here and get it to center. So, I don't know. I didn't try the other pins to see if they were tighter or looser. I don't think they were looser, so I'm leaving these pins in, and I'm happy with that assembly. Now for this ball stud. Notice the old kit, they didn't have the longer stud with the nut on the backside, so those studs have a habit of pulling out of the hub carriers. So now I'm doing something wrong here. It's not because I don't know, I'm not paying attention, right? So, and, you know, why? Why am I not paying attention? I don't know. There's a lot going on. Hey, all right, let's build up the camber link here. Now, these are not turnbuckles, obviously, just threaded rod. That's the way we did it for a long time, at least if you weren't on the inside of the racing scene. Took me a long time to upgrade these to turnbuckles. So the lengths listed in the catalog or the manual here are pretty close. Now I'm noticing my ball stud is in the wrong place, so I'm not going to move the hub carriers around. I'm just going to take that ball stud and flip it onto the other side, and now everything will pop together. That doesn't look too bad, but you really can't tell until you get a wheel on there. I'm making a slight adjustment. Now, this little bushing has to go into the out drive so the dog bone has something to sit against. I really like how these were spring-loaded. There's a spring I'm putting into the axle, and then that biases the dog bone in toward the transmission. It sits against that bushing. It all works really well. When they went to the 3/16 straight axles, there's no space for that spring anymore. But then we all went to either U-joints or CV joints, so you didn't really need them anymore. Here is the link for the front steering, and we just want to get that nice and parallel and pop that into place. Building these tie rod assemblies is one of the more mind-numbing tasks in the build, and I won't bore us with all of the details here, but I'm going to put together the camber and the steering links, and now we'll just pop them all on. This is the fun part. And the ball cups pop on pretty easily, and they would also pop off in a race scenario if you crash. So that's why we all upgraded to other styles, but everything is looking good, but I'm noticing something here. What's this? I'm having a sticking point. Something is binding. And it's not because it's tight, it's hitting. So look, this is a 30-degree camber block. In the upper right-hand corner is the original part for the Edinger gold pan. It's a 15-degree. And you can see the kingpin angle on this is much steeper. And here the steering block is hitting the control arm. And this is something I'm not familiar with because I've never tried to put a 30-degree block on these old short arm Edinger gold pans. And so here's my classic. This has the 15 degree, and you can see here it's not binding. and it's a more upright position for the kingpin. But there it binds. So what are we going to do? We are going to round off the corner of this arm, and there it is. And if you take your time with the Dremel, you can get it nice and almost look factory. I could have done both sides, but I didn't want to do more than I had to. So let's see if this does the trick. We just have to pop these pins back in on both sides, and then we'll see if we have clearance. Now, here it is, and yeah, it's not hitting anymore, so I'm really happy about that. But there is something else that eventually hits, and so the steering arm coming off the block eventually will also hit the control arm, but we've got some decent turning radius out of it before that happens. You could take more material off, but I don't want to do that. But see, it's hitting the arm right there. Again, that's because of the 30-degree camber block. So, interesting. Don't forget to put our E-clips back on here, and I'm happy with where we're at. So, now we're starting to look like a car here. We've got front and rear arms on, so time to build the shocks. And these go together like all the other kit shocks go. Really very trouble-free. Mark the little 2 there, even though I probably never bothered to look again at that. And pop the E-clip on, and these go without interference, so that works pretty easily. Now I'm going to use some slime on my tool for mounting all of the inner seal components. So first we have that spacer, and then an O-ring, and then the big thick spacer in the middle, another O-ring, and little outer washer spacer. When these go into the body, you want to push down on a surface, not like that, until it clicks. It's pretty obvious. And then you can see the seals inside there. So it's satisfying. And this is not the way the original Edinger bodies were made. They were bottom loaders, but I have nothing against these. Now this shows 2 little spacers, but look at the manual up in the top. It had you put a long piece of fuel line inside to limit the downstroke on the rear shocks. We're going to see later that that is an issue. All right, now we'll put the eyelets together. These are a little bit loose. This is the one component I felt is a little looser than it needs to be. They give you 2 lengths of these shock rod ends and don't tell you which one to use. The plastic runner that these come on is kind of a generic parts tree. And I think the longer one is correct. It matches more closely to the original. And so that's what I used on all these. Now I'm lubing up these O-rings for the cap. And we'll just put the front on, and then we'll be ready for fluid. This kit comes with 30 weight, like most of the kits seem to be coming with. We'll need to get our bubbles out and then top everything off. And then we can put our cap in place. They say to put a little fluid in the inside of the cap, but if you do that, it's way too much fluid. I find that if you just top it all the way off and put the cap on, that's pretty good. But you can play with it. It's hard to bleed these because there's no bleeder screw, so it's kind of messy. The original shocks had a flat washer between the cap and the body. These have an O-ring, so you don't have to tighten these up too much. Be careful with these shock collars. You don't want to over-tighten these screws. There's not much thread there, but if you're gentle, they work fine. And we'll put the spring cup on there the right way. And then the springs are a little short. As we'll see, we really need a little more of a downstroke limiter on these. And then the spring would be the right length. The front shocks are just plain short. And it's surprising how short they are when you see them. But it seemed okay at the time. I would say, though, that even back then, I always felt like the front suspension let down the car a bit compared to the rear. The rear seemed really good, a nice amount of suspension travel, and the fronts were a little bit too limited. That got fixed once they went to the long arms. And now we're just putting these pins through the lower shock eyelets, and then there's a set screw that will hold those in place. This actually goes in pretty easily, but it's meant to sit against a relief in that pin. So you kind of have to move the pin back and forth if you want to feel that you're in the right place, but it should stick out the front of the arm just a little bit like shown there, and that's going to be in the right spot for the set screw to catch that relief. And then once that's in there, it really can't let the pin out. So here we go. And now, again, we mounted the upper shock points at the lowest position. So that is the most suspension travel you'll ever see on one of these short gull wing arm setups. I think this is my favorite step of the whole assembly process for these gold pans, installing the rear shocks. They are super cool looking. But here, we'll notice that we have to compress the shock to get it to fit into the appropriate hole on the rear arm. Now, that means that that arm is acting as the downstop. And the way they originally designed this was the shock was supposed to have an internal limiter that limited the downstroke, because the plastic on that control arm will start to give way to the aluminum chassis, and that will allow the arm to go down too low and start to damage the dog bones and the drive and output shaft of the gearbox. So this is a problem if you're going to run this car. You need to do what the original manual said and put some tubing or some other larger limiter until that shock does not extend below the point that the rear arm wants to go to. All right, now we need to tighten up the nuts, and we've got everything. The front's looking good, and I gotta say, the ride height's too high, but that suspension looks good in the front. The back always feels good. So there we go. Now, look at that with the gold shocks and the gold pan. Beautiful. Now we get to put on this bumper. This is one of Jay's little modifications from one of his first sponsors. And we'll just put everything together so we don't get the Loctite in all these holes. Now, this covers up our Team Associated logo, or AE logo, but it's okay because this pan is stamped and you can see it from the other side, which is pretty cool. Unlike the 2013-2014 reissues that were etched and did not show through to the backside at all. Now, getting this nose tube to go together is a little bit of a pain. This one's a little long, so if it were short, I could just loosen up the front screw, but it was long, so I had to kind of bend things around. This one went okay. Take your time, just don't cross-thread it, and then do your final tightening with an L-arm. Make sure it's crisp. These little button head screws round out really easily, but boy, that has a distinctive look, and I'm excited about it. Those nose tubes, again, are much nicer than the originals. Okay, antenna mount. Well, this is a simple one, but there it is. Battery cup, and they only give you the one cup like all the reissues. You can only mount the battery front to back, but that's the cool way to do it anyway. And then we've got our strap, and then now they show a washer on top of the slotted strap side, which that was never the case on the original, but makes sense. Both of these screws they give you for the battery cup have the cross holes in them for the retaining clip, so you don't have to worry about which one. I don't like these retaining clips. These do not look period correct to me. I'm going back to one of the original style. I like the look of that. Next up, servo mounts. And at this point, you might be thinking to yourself, is Bob actually going to drive this car? Because he's not installing a servo. And more on that to come. Yeah, I'm not putting a servo in here. Anyway, these mounts go in easily, and there are two holes, but I could never find a servo that would fit in the narrower rear position. So this would be the standard location, and oh man, I'm really having a nostalgic feel at this point. This is just so much fun. And now the gear cover. This is already cut out, which makes it super easy. The originals you had to cut, and it comes with two button head screws and a nice, soft, pliable cap. The original dust cover would have been more translucent, but I don't know what Jay had on his car. It looks good. Here are the iconic front wheels and tires, and these things are robust. They fit tightly together. And you could tell this would have been preferred for a racing environment. These wheels are not going to come apart on you. Now, they fit together snugly to the point where you really need some lube on these rims to get them to slide into the rubber. And so I added some slime. It'd probably be better to put it on the tire itself, but I did it on the rim, and then it pops in and it goes. You got to line the holes up, and then also on the back side as well. So 3-piece wheel, really robust. And then instead of the screws just going into plastic, these have retaining nuts. And the nuts fit into hex pockets. This was really high tech for the time. This is about as race ready and rugged as you were going to get. And putting these screws in is very confidence inspiring because they fit with a lot of security, and the finished product looks good. I would go racing with that. So now to the rears. These are totally stock fare. We have to put the ring inside, and then these all slide together without any issue. I didn't have to add any lube on these, just like I remember it. They're fun to put together. They're very easy. You only have 3 screws, and they go just into plastic. Don't over tighten them, but I think they held together pretty well. I never had one come apart, but the front tires and wheels, they're just over the top rugged. All right, so now the bearings that I got with the Classic are 5/16 OD, and we need 3/8" OD. So I ordered a second set of 10. So I have some extras. I use these on other things as well. These fit tightly into Jay's aftermarket wheels, but they fit really well. Just make sure you get them all the way in there. You could use a little wrench that sits on the OD. Don't push on the ID, only on the outer ring, and push them all the way in. And now we can install them on the car. Now, when I put this first wheel on, for some reason, it didn't go all the way on. It got a little tight on the shaft, and I was wondering, is that the wheel wider? It's too wide for the axle, but then suddenly it slid the rest of the way in, and it was good. So no issue there. The second one slid all the way on, no problem. And these definitely have a distinctive look, and they spin nicely thanks to the ball bearings. The rear wheels are stock fare and go on nicely. I'm using the actual hex nuts, hex lock nuts. You also get the little plastic knockoff spinners, but Jay wouldn't have used those. Look at the suspension. Now, again, this thing sits high. Kind of astonishingly so, but it feels good. I could see this thing back in the day on those dirt tracks. Look how high it is. Man, it looks like, I don't know, a rock crawler or something. This is a beautiful gold pan. I just love these cars. And Jay's upgrades add that extra little bit of flair and connect it to that first IFMAR World Championship in Del Mar, California. This car was really enjoyable to build, and aside from a couple speed bumps that came up along the way, everything went together really easily. The question is, did Jay have 30-degree caster blocks on his 1985 IFMAR World Championship car? If you know, drop me a comment below. You're saying to yourself now, Bob, I thought you told us these cars are meant to be driven. What's up? So without further ado, Bob's top 5 excuses for not driving the Jay Halsey Edition RC10. Number 5. We've got a lot of cars to get to the track, including the RC10T. That car's been waiting a long time, and time is limited. Number 4. It would be really nice not to have to buy another set of electronics for this car. That stuff adds up. Number 3 on the list. If I put a servo in this car, it would cover up this beautiful laser-etched logo with the Jam & J signature. Come on! Number 2, I would take off some of the distinguishing features of this car to go to the track, like the front wheels and tires and the wing, and then it would just be another gold pan, so what's the point? And the number 1 reason on Bob's list of excuses for not driving the Jay Halsey RC10, I've got 2 other gold pans. I've driven them extensively. I know what gold pans drive like. I'd rather just admire the beauty of this car and leave it on the shelf. Next time on Hot Track RC, we're going to paint up the body for this car and we're going to apply those decals. It looks like it's going to be tricky, so let's see how good we can make it look. So if you're interested, check it out and we'll see you next time.